Well, hello again. Welcome back. I hope you had a nice lunch, but it's time to continue. I just have one quick announcement for those delegates who have arrived and registered today, but have not yet received their name tags and membership cards. Be sure to do that after this plenary at the registration desks. So the name tags and membership cards are now printed and you can collect them there. Thank you.
We are very pleased to have Piotr Steinbrich as one of the plenary speakers in Apatia this year. Piotr is the lecturer and teacher trainer at the Catholic University of Lublin, Poland. He does seminars and workshops for teachers of English in Poland and abroad. Piotr is also a consultant of ELT materials for Pearson for young learners and teenagers. Please welcome Piotr.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right? Yes. So good afternoon, everybody. Let me try it again. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
That's so much nicer, isn't it? Thank you very, very much for coming here after lunch. If I were you, I probably wouldn't. And I'm really happy to be here. I'd like to thank Hubert for inviting me to do this plenary. And I'd like to thank Pearson as well for paying my expenses at Hubert. Thank you. Thank you. In this talk, I'm going to verbalise my concerns about English as a lingua franca and its spread all over the world as a method, as a way to teach English as a foreign language. But before I do so, I would like to say happy birthday to Hubert. You're no longer a teenager, are you? The bad news is that in 20 years you will look like me. We're not going to sing happy birthday, are we?
No.
No. Tonight, yeah, right, tonight is much better. So, English as a lingua franca. Graddle, in his seminal book on English in general, he wrote that teaching and learning English as a lingua franca is probably the most radical and controversial approach that emerged in recent years. And this is true. And in this presentation, I'm going to show you that it is really radical, that it is really new, and perhaps it's also a little bit dangerous. So I'm going to take a rather negative stance towards English as a lingua franca. Basically, ELF is about the following issues. It favours intelligibility rather than native like accuracy, and intelligibility is central. We have to be communicative, we have to use English as a foreign language for a reason. It also lists core features of English as important and peripheral features of English as less important, And those core features are referred to as the lingua franca core in phonology, vocabulary and grammar. And I'm going to talk about it in more detail in about 10 minutes. Also, it claims that English does not belong to native speakers anymore because native speakers are the minority when it comes to using English. So English belongs to us non-native speaker users of the language, and it's no longer the preserve of native speakers. I think I've got to make one thing clear. I do believe that we are all using English as a lingua franca, but I'm really concerned about teaching English as a lingua franca in the classroom. The examples given by Steinbrich2 of English as a lingua franca or ELF use would be as follows. She looked very sad. The book who I like, Steinbrich2 doesn't like articles, and she says we can live quite happily without them. They should arrive soon, isn't it? Where the tags would be universal, or there would be one universal tag for all the statements, and things like advices or informations would be acceptable. And again, I'm saying that these things are acceptable, but because they are understandable. But my question is whether we should be teaching them in the classroom or not. So I've got to move my laptop because it's not really very comfortable. And I'd like to show you an example of an ELF exchange. This is a real exchange, something that happened to me a few years ago when I was in Romania, in a hotel in Bucharest, where I had to exercise some English as a lingua franca with the receptionist. S would be me, R would be the receptionist. S stands for Steinbrich, which is my name. So I went down to the reception because I had a problem with the internet connection, the Wi-Fi connection in my room. And this is how I started the exchange. I said hi to the receptionist, and she said back to me, yes. And I said the following: I'm afraid there's something wrong with the Wi-Fi internet connection in my room. What's wrong in your room? The internet doesn't work. No? No. It works. No, it doesn't. Okay, bring me laptop. Right, 5 minutes, okay? So this exchange shows a problem that ELF proponents fail to see, fail to notice. And this is the problem of different speakers of English as a foreign language having different levels of proficiency. Me versus the receptionist. My competence was slightly higher than hers. And what I had to do, I had to tone down my English. So as a matter of fact, my English as a lingua franca was different in her in the context of the Wi-Fi internet connection problem, because I had to tone it down, and she was using her typical English as a lingua franca. Steinbrich2 in her seminal work wrote that to realize the idea of an ELF model, it is crucial to determine how speakers from different L1 backgrounds actually communicate to ELF, how they co-construct English in the process. So if we go back to our ELF exchange, co-constructing English basically meant that I had to go down a few levels to be understood by the receptionist and to sort out the internet problem, the Wi-Fi problem in my room. So co-constructing seems to be a key concept in the ELF model. Saying, I'm afraid there's something wrong with the Wi-Fi internet connection in my room, suddenly had to be changed into the following: the internet doesn't work. Something I could probably say, will that be okay if I'll be back with you in a couple of minutes, was changed into that, 5 minutes, okay, because the message was important, more important than form. So basically co-constructing, as I was saying earlier, for me, it just meant using English at the level of my discourse participant. Some time ago, I got a great book, which I think is a very nice ELF book, the book called Happy Starts with English. The book published in Ukraine. I got it from my friend and colleague Rob Dean, who went to Ukraine and got this book from one of the teachers. And as you can see here, the cover is very English, isn't it? We've got, obviously, the Buckingham Palace there, springing up somewhere near Manchester, apparently. Yeah, not Yorkshire. And this is what the book looks like. It gives learners the whole set of phrases which would be useful in communication. And I'd like to draw attention to a few of those phrases. I'm glad to greet you. I've never heard anything like that before anywhere. Which is immediately translated into Ukrainian. If you can read Ukrainian, that's what it says. Good afternoon, which is Доброго dня. I've been told by reliable sources. But also good day. The Australian way of saying hello is Доброго dня, the same thing. So it basically means that it gives learners the options. And when we talk about co-constructing English or using our L1 background, knowledge or skill or abilities, obviously the question is, how does it work? Is it the English language which is influencing our first languages, or is it the first languages which are or should be influencing English? In other words, which way does it work? And I'd like to look at two aspects here. I'd like to look at the micro scale influences and the macro scale influences. And this is going to be natural English. The first example from Poland, last minute, which I believe is highly universal. You probably have last minute here as well, as everybody in the world. But I'm not sure if you have first minute. And this is in Poland. So the phrase last minute has been converted into first minute. You know, the earlier you buy, the cheaper it is, the less you pay for it. But I don't think that the concept of first minute actually exists in English. Does it? No, it's just a Polish invention, isn't it? Do you know what these are? Tails, right. In Polish we call them tipsy. You know, the tips, which is further pluralized, so we've got some kind of double plural. Recently I was traveling to Estonia and I got this. And the lady said to me in Polish at the airport in Warsaw, I'm going to give you deliberka. I was like, what are you talking about? I've never heard the word before, deliberka. And apparently she used the delivery of aircraft phrase and kind of converted it into Polish. You know, delivery, deliberka. Something I've never heard before. Probably if you think about your jargon, the language that you're using with your colleagues at work, with your friends you work with, you would find examples of how English influenced Croatian as well, don't you? Yeah, like, do you use the word board or blackboard? No, but you probably use others that I'm not really aware of. And it's really difficult to find examples where the first language, like Croatian or Polish, actually influences English. Probably the examples that might spring to mind would deal with things which are impossible to translate or difficult to translate conceptually, like food vocabulary, for example. Yeah, like something that looks similar, but perhaps it's better to use the word pierogi and not dumplings or ravioli or anything like that. Yeah, because there's no equivalent in English for that. So basically, co-constructing English is the concept of English influencing the first languages, and not as Elfers are saying, the other way around. And when we think about ELF, again, if we go back to the example of the conversation at the reception desk in the Bucharest Hotel, what we were using were different levels of interlanguage. Basically, when we think about ELF is like interlanguage. We have different levels. We've got different interlanguages being influenced by different first languages, Romanian, Polish, Croatian, grammatically, lexically, phonologically as well. And those levels of interlanguage will be different from user to user. And usually, it's the user with a higher level of English that has to adjust their English to the level of the user of a lower level of the language. If we try that the other way around, it simply doesn't work. So when we think about interlanguages or interlanguage, and if we compare interlanguage to English as a lingua franca, we see lots and lots of inconsistencies because interlanguages vary, and they vary systematically, because they exhibit common accuracy orders in developmental sequences as well. And as I was saying earlier, they are introduced by learners' first languages. And it's not me saying that, it's Diane Larson Freeman and Michael Long writing about it nearly 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, apparently. If ELF was used in the classroom, would you like to use a book like that? ELF 1 Level C2, written by myself and Rob Dean, Authentic Pidgin English for International Communication. What you might find inside would be teaching the learners how to be communicative in the language only. So probably we would have some problems in choosing or designing materials for that book. Where would you find authentic materials? Where would you get that from? From the receptionist in the Bucharest Hotel? Conversational expressions, if they vary from language to language, from L1 to L1, then it would be very inconsistent in terms of the selection of those expressions. What would be the discourse norm for communication? You know that in English we say please and thank you every second word, virtually. And that's the norm. If we talk about different L1 backgrounds, probably this will have to go. And English will sound extremely rude because of that. What kind of literature would we use? Written by whom? What kind of pronunciation patterns will be offered to the learners? What kind of grammar are we going to give them? If everything goes, as long as it's understood, probably we don't need grammar at all. So problems, problems, problems. Another famous quote from Zeidhofer is as follows. The ELF model should not be oriented towards native speaker usage. The international ELF speech community should no longer be regarded as non-dependent, but as non-developing and ultimately non-providing. Which means that you here in Croatia and we back in Poland should be providing norms for the use of the language of English. And then of course questions arise. Is it possible to provide common norms of ELF which are not English as a native language dependent? Probably those norms would differ from L1 to L1. Will the selection of norms depend on the number of the users following or preferring a particular norm? If you, for example, compare Slovenian users of the language of English and Chinese users of the language, there's what, 2 million Slovenians in the world and about 2 billion Chinese people. So whose norms will be more important? It's hard to say. So again, as a matter of fact, what is happening is that we are creating a model which is not a native-based model, but we're creating a model. And another important question, will native speakers be able to learn English as a lingua franca in order to teach it? And they will be no longer native speakers. We will be native speakers of ELF. We can teach them English with all our norms. Widdowson, in 1994, he said that native speakers are irrelevant. When we talk about English, English does not belong to native speakers. They are irrelevant in the description of the language. Zeidhofer, again, she was saying that nativeness and standard English are criticized as belonging to the minority of English users, and they should be rejected. So, again, not native speakers are irrelevant. Drummer was a bit more sensible about it. He said that the fiction of a homogeneous standard English is rightly exposed by ELF, because who speaks standard English these days? Maybe the Queen. BBC, I wouldn't say so really. I think it's just the Queen. But he said that I would argue that standard English is subject to appropriation through the agency of its users, which means that we are teaching the learners some kind of approximation of standard English, and what they are doing with it is what they are doing with it. So if we try to set up norms for English as a lingua franca use, I was trying to think about it in more concrete terms, to think about structures, to think about vocabulary, to think through the prism of Slavic or Slavonic languages. Probably we would have to make English easier for the learners and to make it friendlier for the learners. We might like to say good riddance to the following. The infamous S in the third person singular would go, because it's completely unnecessary. If you say he go, everybody understands what you mean. Irregular verbs, they are a nuisance for the learners. If you say he goed, it's as good, if not better, than he went. It's definitely easier to learn. Articles. In Croatian there are no articles, are there? No. And you're happy. So we can say goodbye to articles. The backshift rule in reported speech. Why on earth should we teach that to the learners? But it should also go. Pleonastic it. You know, it was raining in the morning, wasn't it? And then what is this it thing? Why can't we just say, was raining in the morning? Or just rained in the morning? Because it means nothing at all. Yeah? It's very highly kind of elusive, we could say. So it also goes. It fronting. It was John who did it. John did it. Isn't that nicer? Used to. Why don't we use just the past tense for that? We'll be extremely happy with it. And our students will be even happier. Past would. He would go and he would do this and that. He went and he goed. And he do it. This and that. Short answer follow-ups. That's what children love. Can you speak Chinese? No, I can't. You don't have to use I can't. No is enough. The message is clear, yes or no. The third conditional, a real nightmare. If your first language is something Slavic or Slavonic, you don't have it in Croatian, you do. Because we used to have it in Polish, but it's long gone. We just didn't need it. And we used the second conditional for both. And in English, I think, the same might happen. Wish, referring to the past. You know, from what I remember, wishes are about the future, not about the past. You can moan and complain about the past, but you don't have to use wish, so it would also go. Indirect question forms. Can you tell me what time it is? Why do we have to do that in English? We don't. Can you tell me what time is it? It's much better, because you don't have to think too much while saying it. On top of that, I would suggest the following changes. The unification of this and that. We don't need the distance. We could use just this, and that could also go. Here and there. I mean, it won't be clear from the context what we use and what we mean. All the self forms. Myself, but themselves. Why don't we have just self for everyone? It will be much easier. Replacing there is and there are for the subject verb object constructions. There's a cat under the table. The cat is under the table. It's much easier for the learners. Will and would use them if clauses. You know, we tell our students never use will in the if clause, please. And then, of course, a year later we say, well, actually you can, but it means something different. Why don't we just tell them to use them if they want to? And it will not really affect the meaning, because we will understand what they're saying, and it will be so much easier to learn English as a lingua franca. And finally, the time tense agreement. If you talk about the past, use past tenses. If you talk about the future, use future tenses. If you talk about the present, use present tenses. Don't complicate things. Not like, I'm in the bar and this bloke comes in and blah blah blah, and it's all about yesterday. So, just confusing. So now, bearing all those in mind, what you could do is just to open a British newspaper and try to introduce those changes and see what you get. English as a lingua franca. One of the most famous quotes from Jennifer Jenkins, the other big proponent of ELF, was something I call child logic. She said, there's really no justification for doggedly persisting in referring to an item as an error if the vast majority of the world's L2 English speakers produce and understand it. For example, the infamous S in the third person singular. He go, she go. And when you think about it, what she postulates is that we have no norms whatsoever for language use. And I'm trying to tweak this sentence a little bit to show how logical it is. There's really no justification for doggedly persisting in imposing the speed limit on the Croatian roads if the vast majority of the Croatian drivers exceed it, showing no remorse. I'm sure most of you would say, yes, please. There's really no justification for doggedly persisting in imposing taxes if the vast majority of taxpayers are only too happy to avoid them. And you can continue, you can basically use the model and just fill the gaps with whatever you want. But that means no rules for nothing. So, in my opinion, what ELFers are confusing is language learning with language use. So, the input that the students receive in the classroom and what actually they do with this input. So, how they use language in real-life communicative situations, which of course are two different things, chalk and cheese. And I was thinking, what might possibly happen if we taught our students this English as a lingua franca as a model? What would they do with it? Because if they convert what we call standard or standardized English into ELF, then if we treat ELF as the input, what kind of thing will come out of it in real-life communicative encounters? Hard to say. Do you recognise this gentleman?
Yeah.
Yes, it's Michael Phelps. Yes, Michael Phelps. And I'd like to use Michael Phelps as a metaphor for process and products, for input and output. Process would be him practicing, swimming, doing all those breathing exercises, jumping into the pool, returning, and all sorts of things. The product will be Olympic Games or Olympic gold medals, more like it. Our students would go through a very similar process. For them, the process would be the English that they experience in the classroom, which will be this standard English that we teach them, and the product will be ELF. The product will be what they do with what they have been exposed to in the classroom. And this exposure, or this input, before it's produced in real, actual context by the learners, it goes through a filter. And the filter will have a number of different variables, like, we'll have to consider learners' language aptitude. How good are they in learning foreign languages? Because, as we all know, not all of them are so good. We'll have a lot of affective factors, like when you think, for example, about adults struggling with a TH sound. They wouldn't do it because it just sounds stupid. Not that they can't. Tolerating something that is different from what they know, from what they're familiar with, which is their first language. What the first language is. It's much easier to learn English for the Dutch than it is for the Croatians, because the L1 background is different. The quality and quantity of input will be important as well, and all those sociolinguistic conventions I mentioned earlier. So input, we treat input as the process, and output is the actual language that the learners are producing, and that would be English as a lingua franca, because as I was saying earlier, I do believe that most of us would be producing English as a lingua franca. but this is not something that we should be teaching to our students. Just a quick exercise for you. Would you correct this? A student saying, the man wearing dark glasses, so describing a person. The man wearing dark glasses, and I think so, was coat for rain, in blue colour, and jeans. So, and jeans. And large shoes also, until knee. Would you correct it? Of course.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, there's a catch. If it was an exam-based picture description speaking activity, definitely, I would. Yeah, because this is part of the process. If you were a police officer listening to a crime witness, no, because it would just sound rude, wouldn't it? I'm sorry, don't use article here, the plural. It would just sound stupid, wouldn't it? Yeah? So, input versus output, or process versus product. Product, this is fine, this is acceptable, but it doesn't mean that we should be teaching or accepting this kind of English in some classroom situations. And I'm sure that you could provide me with a number of examples of such sentences by the learners, by the students. I've got a few for you. My chest is big and green. A student describing some furniture, apparently. My sister's having 3 cats. Which is disgusting when I think about it. So, the selection of the appropriate tense is important, isn't it? She likes talking to the phone. She's kind of schizophrenic when I think about it. But it's, a small thing like a preposition makes a whole big difference here. The worm is coming. And the meaning here was that the spring is coming, and it's warm in spring, but it was worm. So pronunciation comes in quite handy in some contexts. I like to see that. I spent Christmas in the Turkey. So articles would be important in some contexts, in some situations. Anna tried to throw up smoking. Something as unpleasant as phrasal verbs. Give up, throw up, there's no difference really. Intercourse between trams should be about 6 minutes. That is on the verge of pornography, isn't it? Complex words, intervals was probably what the students had in mind. The seaside town has a small stone beach. And Scottish people speak English with a funny accent. And many, many more. So this just shows you that in some contexts, some features that ELF rejects are really important. ELF doesn't like culture. The ELF model should be as free as possible from cultural baggage taken out from English as a native language cultures, since they are not privileged when it comes to English being used as a lingua franca. So, if we decide to teach ELF, we should not be focusing on British culture, American culture, Australian culture, New Zealand culture, and what have you. You probably recognise some of those things, don't you? Yeah, like we've got John Bull here, tea, village breakfast, bulldog, all the cliched examples of the British culture. But it's not just that. As I was saying earlier, there are some concepts that belong to certain domains which are simply impossible without culture, like nouvelle cuisine, like smacznego, like smorgasbord, pardon my Swedish pronunciation. They're just impossible to translate because they are culturally rooted. So it's food vocabulary, it's religion, it's politics. If you think of conservative, what conservative means in Croatia, probably would mean something different than in England or in Poland or in Germany. Sports. teenage slang as well. I like hottie. And if we get rid of the cultural component, it's not just not teaching the learners about the Queen, about the Buckingham Palace, but also those nuances, those aspects of behavioural culture as well, that very often manifest themselves in language use. If a British person stands on another British person's foot, who says sorry first? That's a good question. Actually, this happened to me not a long time ago. I was in a lift in the office building, and I stepped on somebody else's foot, and she said sorry to me. And I thought I could do that again if you like. I didn't. But it's a convention. Sorry, can you tell me the time? Which is as good these days as excuse me, can you tell me the time? But sorry means something that I apologise for interrupting you, but could you please tell me what time it is? Kate Fox did some research on how many times does the average British person say thank you during a transaction at the supermarket checkout. And she said 5 times, which is quite a lot. If you do your shopping here in Croatia, you can count how many times you say thank you at the supermarket checkout. Or why are the British indirect in face-to-face communication? I don't know why, but apparently they are. Yeah, and this is also part of the culture, part of this behavioural culture. And if you think of a basic, simple activity for the students, in pairs, prepare for these role plays. Ask a stranger to close a window on a train. Decide with a friend what to do at the weekend. Ask a neighbour to post a letter for you. Ask a friend to return a magazine he or she borrowed. Decide where to go on holiday with a friend. Ask a waiter to give you the menu. We have to focus on those sociolinguistic conventions. We have to focus on the culture. Because students may get it right grammatically. Give me the menu. This was kind of rude. Yeah? So we have to teach them all those please and thank you and sorry things to make sure that they just don't sound okay grammatically, but they sound fine sociolinguistically or culturally as well. In order to be learnable and teachable, the ELF model should aim at a considerable reduction of complexity, mainly through elimination of communicative redundancy. All those features that we listed 15, I think, minutes ago. And there were attempts to do it in the past. Probably one of the most famous was English as She Is Spoke, written in the 18th century by 2 Portuguese friends who actually could not speak English at all. They wrote a handbook that was full of English vocabulary and full of English phrases. And it was meant to be simple, simplistic, and learner-friendly. An example dialogue from English as She Spoke. How is that gentleman who you did speak by and by? Is a German. I did think him Englishman. He's of the Saxony side. He speaks the French very well. No S, mind you. Though he's German, he speaks so much well Italian, French, Spanish and English. And among the Italians, they believe him Italian, he speaks the French as the Frenches themselves. The Spanishmen believe him Spanishing, and the English as Englishman. It is difficult to enjoy well so much several languages. It is difficult, as you can see. That was the first attempt. It didn't really catch on as a model of the language. Then in the 1930s, Richard Ogden wrote a book called Basic English, which was a collection of more than 800 core words and simple grammatical structures that were basic English, in his opinion. A controlled language created as an international auxiliary language and as an aid for teaching English as a second language. And again, it did not really catch on. I mean, historically it's interesting, but it wasn't good as a model. Even Quirk, in 1982, wrote the following about nuclear English. He said it would be the core of structure and vocabulary from within the range of acceptable English. It would eliminate all features that are dispensable, so as to be left with the obligatory minimum of the language, its communicative nucleus. And the funny thing about that, two funny things about it. One thing is that he wrote that in his thick book about grammar, you know, the 2,000-page book about grammar. I can't remember the title of it. Something like Everything You Get Wrong in English But Too Stupid to Realize, something like that. And apparently it was just this one single paragraph about nuclear English. So he did not follow suit here. And when we think about what an ideal lingua franca would be, it should be characterized by maximum speakability, which English is, isn't it? Because lots and lots of people use English as a foreign or as a second language. It should have sensible orthography, which English is not really famous for, is it? Kind of manic orthography. Regular inflection rules, which is kind of so-so, because English is a primitive language, there's no inflection in English apart from S in the third person singular. Uncomplicated grammar, but we immediately think about the number of the tenses that English has. And it has how many? But two, which is past and present, because future is not really a tense. You use a modal verb or you use the present tenses to express it. Freedom from ambiguity. Every language is ambiguous. It's impossible to have a language which is unambiguous. I mean, Esperanto was, but nobody uses it these days. Learning accessibility. Of course, English is. That's why we're here. And when we think about using that common sense of English being a lingua franca, English is unpronounceable. It's impossible. When you read it, you never know how to pronounce it, do you? That's why we sell pronunciation dictionaries. English is irregular, as every language is. English is complex, as every language is. English is ambiguous, and that's good. And it is still a lingua franca, because the first criterion seems the most important. Lots and lots of people use it. I've got another activity for you here, a very non-ELF activity on varieties of English. I want you to look at these 6 exchanges, really, and I want you to decide which English each of these exchanges represents. Okay, so you could say hello to the person sitting next to you and try to do it, and I'll have a sip of water. So, the first one, America. That's right, some part of America. The second one, British. Well, I think I need to explain the context. My friend told me that, he gave me this example. He was in Malaysia. This actually is from Singapore and Malaysia. And he was in a very, very posh hotel. And he was in a lift going down to the restaurant to have his breakfast, or lunch, or whatever, something to eat. And then this gentleman, you know, a very smartly dressed businessman probably, asked him the following question: have you had your lunch? I was like, do I know you? He said, not yet. And actually, this was a way to say hello there, asking if you've had your food, or a meal, or not. Okay, so it's quite an unusual way of saying hello, but it works still in countries where English is the second or the first language. Good day, good day. Australia. How are you today? I'm fine, thank you. I'll say it's called for English, isn't it? In British, we'll be like, you good? Good. Or something like that. Alright. It's Northern English. How's it going? Fine, thanks. Call it bland British. Yeah, nothing really special. But as you see, there are different ways of saying such a basic thing as hello in English, depending on where you're from. Probably, if we introduced English as a lingua franca in the classroom, we would have to think about a number of other possibilities, depending on the L1 used by the learners. But the funny thing is that even within British English, there would be linguistic and cultural differences. For example, concerning food. Like upper or middle classes would use breakfast, lunch, tea would be optional, and then they'd have either dinner or supper in the evening. Lower classes would have breakfast, they wouldn't have lunch, they'd have dinner, they'd have tea, and tea would be the most important meal of the day, not necessarily the 5 o'clock thing. And then supper would be something optional. So the same names for different concepts within the same language, within the same country. What is the point here is just the class difference. And trying to synthesize this information that I was providing you with in this talk, in this presentation, this dialogue would represent a typical, I would say, course book exchange that we teach our learners. Would you care for some coffee? Yes, please, I'd love to. How about your friend? I'm sure he'd love a cup too, please. Here you are. Thank you very much indeed. That would be the input thing. Yeah, that would be something that you are likely to find in course books or in materials. Real English would be slightly different. Coffee? Sure. Here, mate? Yeah. Here you are. Cheers. As simple as that. Something that is not that teachable when you think about it, unless you create a real context for it, and if your students are at the high proficiency level. I remember once being in charge of a group of students in London, and it was their first ever experience in England, and they were all shocked by the way the British use glottal stops. You know, this kind of barking thing when they speak. You know, this kind of thing. And they thought, this sounds extremely English, and they all wanted to use that glottal stops, and they did, and nobody could understand them. So you have to have the right proficiency level to learn certain things. And here, as I was saying, it's unteachable unless you provide the students with the right context. When you think about the possible lingua franca exchange, you know, we've had the course book exchange, the real exchange now, time for the lingua franca exchange. You want coffee? I want. And your friend, you want? Yes, you want. Okay. This is sometimes used by the students, but again, the question is if it should be taught to the students in the classroom. And my answer is not really. And I'd like to finish off by showing you a very important document that was recently issued, and this is just a fragment of it. The European Union Commissioners have announced that agreement has been reached to adopt English as the preferred language for European communications, rather than German, which was the other possibility. As part of the negotiations, Her Majesty's government considered that English spelling had some room for improvement and has accepted a 5-year phased plan for what will be known as Euro-English, Euro for short. So something similar to English as a lingua franca, as a matter of fact. In the first year, S will be used instead of the soft sir. Certainly, civil servants will receive this news with joy. Also, the hard sir will be replaced with care. Not only will this clear up confusion, but typewriters can have one less letter. There will be growing public enthusiasm in the second year when the troublesome PH will be replaced by fur. This will make words like photograph 20% shorter. In the third year, public acceptance of the new spelling can be expected to reach the stage where more complicated changes are possible. Governments will encourage the removal of double letters, which have always been a deterrent to accurate spelling. Also, I will agree that the horrible mess of silent E's in the language is disgraceful, and they would go. By the fourth year, people will be receptive to steps such as replacing TH by Z and W by V. During the fifth year, the unnecessary O can be dropped from words containing O, and similar changes would of course be applied to other combinations of letters. After this fifth year, we will have a really sensible register. There will be no more troubles or difficulties, and everyone will find it as to understand each other. The drum will clearly come through. Thank you very much. Thank you. Just in case, if you would like anything from me, this is my email, but please within reason.